Welcome to Legacy Sips and Tips podcast with your geeky host, Lindsay Wheeler, where we talk about everything from death, preparing for your future through estate planning, life, the occasional breakup, entrepreneurship, general nerdery, and of course travel, snowboard, and always wine. Welcome to Legacy Sips and Tips with your host, Lindsay Wheeler, and today we're going to discuss the Homestead Exemption and why it's probably not what you think it is. So let's talk about the Homestead Exemption. Everyone thinks, oh, well, my home's homesteaded, nobody can steal it from me, creditors can't get to it, what have you. That's semi-true. However, that's not completely true, and we'll discuss why that is. So I'm going to read off my notes so you guys have the full information here. So to help develop the American West and spur economic growth, Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862. So this has been around for a long time. It provided 160 acres of federal land to anybody who agreed to farm the land. The act distributed millions of acres of western land to individual settlers, but that is not the homestead we're talking about in current times. So that's a historic homestead. What most people are referencing these days is the Homestead Exemption, which is a legal regime, fancy word, to protect the value of homes of residents from things like property taxes or creditors or circumstances that arise from the death of the homeowner's spouse. Such laws were found in the statutes or the constitutions of many states in the U.S., of course, apart from New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and we'll discuss those states. The Homestead Exemption in some states of the South has its legal origins in the exemption laws of the Spanish Empire, so that's kind of fun. And in other states, they were enacted in response to the effects of the 19th century economy. Lots of different reasons why the Homestead Exemption and Act came into place, quite historic as well. So the Homestead Exemption is actually, what we talk about now, is a legal provision that protects the homeowners' primary residence from being seized to pay off debts, except for certain types of debts, such as property taxes or mortgage obligations. It can also reduce the taxable value of the property, providing a property tax reduction for the homeowner. And this exemption, of course, will vary from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So, of course, as always, check with your local laws and statutes and codes and whatever your state is ran under to make sure that you're in compliance or that you're taking full advantage of these exemptions for your state and jurisdiction. Again, those exemptions for that homestead will vary from state to state, and in a few states, including Florida and Texas, they afford unlimited financial protection against unsecured creditors for the home. Although in those two states, your acreage limit will apply. So if you have, a big ranch, we might have some issues there. But for the most of us who don't have big, crazy ranches and, looking at like we're in Wyoming or anything like that, if you're in Florida or Texas, you have an unlimited financial protection. So what does that actually mean? So in some states, that homestead protection is automatic. However, most homeowners will receive that protection only if they file a claim with the Homestead Exemption with their state. So you have to file usually a deed on your property to show that this is your primary residence, that you are homesteading it, that you are going to maintain it as your primary residence. This does not apply to your rentals or your condos or your timeshares or your cabin in the hills. This is only for your primary residence. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that people can't just take your land because you didn't pay your debt. That's what the Homestead Exemption is protecting you from, okay? That homestead protection can be lost as well if you abandon that property and the property, you take up primary residence elsewhere. So again, it's always for your primary residence. So if you decide to sell your primary residence or move or what have you, you would revoke that homestead exemption that you had on that first property, and then your new primary residence, you would refile that homestead exemption on that. The protection limits are not for the value of the home, but for the homeowner's equity in it. So if you have $1 million house, but you have a $900,000 mortgage on it, you only have $100,000 in equity in that property. Does that make sense? So it's the property value minus the balance of a mortgage or other financial claims on that property. If the equity is held as less than the limit, the homeowner cannot be forced to sell the property to benefit creditors. So how this works. So let me give you our jurisdiction here. We're in Nevada. The Homestead Exemption is provided under our Nevada Constitution and state law, which allows homeowners to protect a portion of the equity of their primary residence, again, primary residence, against creditors. How that happens is through the Homestead Exemption in a bankruptcy. So it's a bankruptcy exemption, if you will. So you would have, say, got sued, for instance. You have a judgment against you for $500,000. Probably not going to pay that, right? So what will happen is that you will then file bankruptcy. You will then, in that paperwork, claim that homestead exemption, and that in Nevada is up to $605,000 as of 2022 for your homestead exemption of the equity in your property. So if you have a house that's $600,000 of equity, great. They're not going to force you to sell your primary residence to fulfill the judgment that you have against you through that bankruptcy court. Okay. Another cool thing is that the homestead exemption can also provide a reduction in property taxes. So that's kind of fun. In Nevada, you'll use that Nevada state exemption through that federal bankruptcy exemption that are not available as well. In some states, you will have to choose between two different options throughout that homestead exemption on that bankruptcy, whether it's a exemption or it's a non-exempted option for your bankruptcy. In California, next door, the homestead exemption is provided under the state's constitution and is known as the California Homestead Exemption. It protects the homeowner's primary residence, again, from forced sale in the event of a judgment, bankruptcy, or other legal proceedings up to a specified dollar amount. Again, that's that either state exemption amount or the federal exemptions amount. You can use both or pick one or the other depending on which state you're filing your bankruptcy in. California is not one of those states, so you still have an exemption choice. Okay. If you reside in California and eligible to use that California bankruptcy exemption, you will choose one of California's two exemption systems. You can't mix and match them. You have to pick which one protects your property the most. And again, of course, if you're having to file bankruptcy, you're going to get with a bankruptcy attorney and they're going to walk you through this, and they should know that, how that works. Again, in California, they can exempt up to $600,000 in the equity of your home. Also in California, if you file bankruptcy, the homestead exemption is automatic. Oftentimes, a lot of states require you to have that homestead exemption filed before you will kick into place. Many states like California, it is automatic because they want to protect people's homes. They don't want you to be homeless because you were in a car accident or you have medical bills or, whatever it is, credit card debt, what have you. To claim the full value of that homestead exemption in any state, you must have owned the property for at least 1,215 days before your bankruptcy filing. If you cannot meet that requirement, your homestead exemption is limited by the federal law up to $189,000 for cases filed between April 1st, 2022 to March 31st of 2025. So it's always a good idea to check with your particular state and jurisdiction of what those advantages and disadvantages of that homestead exemption is. But typically, it's always a good idea to have that on there because we want to make sure that your primary residence is protected and that you're not going to be kicked out of your home and forced to sell it to fulfill a judgment or a creditor's judgment against you. Let's talk about some disadvantages of a homestead exemption. Some of those might be limitations on selling or transferring your property. Again, always check with your jurisdiction. A homestead property may have restrictions on selling or transferring the property, which can limit your flexibility on that. However, of course, you can always abandon that homestead, option that you have had placed on that property. In some states, you have that property size restriction. So some states have restrictions on the size of the homestead property, which can limit your options if you have a large property. But we're talking about like acres and acres and acres, not like your normal, tract home that you have in the suburbs, or maybe you have an acre worth of land, you have a little homestead or something like that, Income restrictions. So some states do have income restrictions for eligibility, which may limit to your access to that exemption and may only be allowed if you have a lower income homeowner at that point. Location limitations. Sometimes the exemptions may only be available in certain locations or states, which can limit your accessibility. So again, always check with your local jurisdiction. And reduce revenue for local governments. So sometimes the governments don't like these because the homestead exemption can result in reduced revenue for the local governments, which they look at, may cut local programs or things like that because they're not getting the revenue from those property. And then the value reassessment. A homestead exemption can affect the assessed value of the property, which can result in higher taxes sometimes for the homeowner if the property's value increases over time. So again, always check with your local jurisdiction, double check that. But for the most part, it's a really good thing to have the homestead exemption on your home just in case, Again, as we always talk about here, bad things happen. And if we can be prepared and secured as best as we can, let's go ahead and do that. This week's Wine Talk, we are having a Domaine Chandon from the Napa Valley. I know we're on a Napa theme lately. They are usually known for making their sparklings, and they're delightful, frankly. My friend had her bachelorette party there, and I was very happy, let me tell you. However, if you all know how sparklings are made, they're made primarily from 3 different grapes. So we have your Chardonnay, we have your Pinot, and we have your Pinot Meunier, if you will. And that's what this is here. So obviously they're going to have this because it's one of the components into making sparklings or champagnes. And they particularly just decided to bottle this. And this is a fun one. It's really nice. It's light. It's like a typical Pinot, as you will. Got some good fruit notes in there. And it's quite an enjoyable, nice little afternoon wine. So if Domaine Chandon would like to sponsor me, I would love that sponsorship as well. Even though they're not, please do. So I've been talking to you guys about the homestead exemption as it relates to individuals. So what if you have done a good job, you have went through me or whoever it is to get your estate plan in place? Please do. Everyone get your estate plan in place. Okay. We can also have your property that is in your trust homesteaded as well. You're going to now homestead it through your estate plan or through your trust. So as long as the property, again, is being claimed as your primary residence of one of the trust beneficiaries, which is you typically because you're the trustee, which you'd be as the trustor because you're creating that trust. It's your property. You're going to reside in it as your primary residence. You typically will play all 3 roles in that estate plan. You're the trustor creating it again, you're the trustee managing it, and you technically are the beneficiary while you're alive of that trust because those trust assets are being there for you, for your use like you normally do with your assets. So that is why we're able to now homestead our primary residence through our trust and estate plan. So to recap, the homestead exemption is steeped in history, but the modern day homestead exemption that we're talking about here is in relation to your primary residence equity being protected against judgment creditors or through a bankruptcy. And of course, always make sure that you fulfill all the requirements of your local state and jurisdiction, that you meet those requirements, and again, to making sure that you protect your home's equity up to that amount in your state, relatively around $600,000 or more, and making sure that you fulfill all the requirements of either acreage or property value, if you will, to file that homestead exemption. You also can, of course, file it through your estate plan because you were smart and got it done, and making sure that your primary residence through your trust is also protected with that homestead exemption because, as we all know, bad things happen and we want to be as prepared as we can. So if you have questions on that, shoot me a DM or a text on that, and I'll be happy to discuss more about the homestead exemption. And of course, when you think of death, think of me. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you found value, please like, subscribe, and share. And be sure to follow me on all the socials at Sips and Tips with Lindsay. And of course, you can always go to my website, sipsandtipswithlindsay.com, to find more information about estate planning, business, snowboard, travel, and of course, wine. As always, we have to get the legal stuff out of the way. I went to law school, so you don't have to. However, we have to read the special disclaimer that I am not a practicing attorney. I am not your attorney. I am not offering any legal advice in any content or any episode. All content is for your information and educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for seeking your own legal advice from your own attorney or other professionals such as a CPA or financial advisor. I cannot give legal advice and do not offer any legal services or legal advice, but I do offer some fun and educational content for you to enjoy.